Start with the inherent rights. We're talking now about the inherent rights of our nations and our people. The late Judge Lammer from the Supreme Court said, what are they? And where do they come from? They supersede everything. He never ever got an answer. So you're looking at what the inherent rights are. Your traditions, your customs, your values, your practices, your beliefs, and your culture, your language, inherent right to self-government, self-determination, inherent right to citizenship, membership, lands, resources, water, health, social development, education, justice, air, shelter. All those areas are inherent rights that we have. And they come from a source that's not identified either. That source is from the Creator. And all those inherent rights are granted to our nations and our people, collectively. Now, lately we've been caught up in this latest political terminology that the federal government has created to create more difficulty, and it's called the rights holders. They only want to talk to the rights holders, and they define them as the chiefs and councils or individual groups of bands. When I talk about these inherent rights, inherent sovereignty, inherent rights by sector, inherent title to lands and resources, granted to our nations and peoples collectively, they're not issues that are having to be dealt with by one chief and council or one band. These are things that we got to deal with collectively for implementation and enforcement. Now, how do we do that? When we look at the UN Declaration for implementation, I told Minister Jody Wilson once, he was Justice Minister, nobody ever deals in government with the recognition of our inherent rights. Now, when we talk about the implementation of the inherent rights, in talking to Jody Wilson, the former Minister of Justice, like I said, I kind of got her into trouble, as you know, because the federal government has never recognized inherent rights. And the only thing that's been recognized is the indigenous rights, Aboriginal rights, that come from their colonial policy that I'll be highlighting in a little while. But when we look at our responsibilities to implement the inherent rights, inherent sovereignty of our nations, including the governments, jurisdiction, and laws of our nations, the powers of governing, the national powers of treaty making, the inherent rights, like I said, by sector, we need to identify them, like I did, and the list that you see there, but we need to define them. How? In our own languages. Based on what? Based on our worldview, our philosophy, our traditions, our customs, our practices, our beliefs and values. And every nation has that responsibility, to identify all their inherent rights, identify the implementation of how they're going to enforce their sovereignty and their government's jurisdiction and laws. Now, once we do that, people don't realize that there's duties and responsibilities associated with each of those inherent rights that used to be taught in the homes and the communities, and we still can do that. So we need to identify what those duties and responsibilities are for each of those inherent rights and their collective responsibilities. The human rights man-made law only recognizes individual rights. Elders will tell you the collective rights that we have enforces individual rights. And when we look at that process, then once we know what the duties and responsibilities are for each of the inherent rights we have, what are the plans and strategies we have for implementing them by sector? Like the inherent right to education, inherent right to social development, and so on. And when we do that, in terms of implementation, we talk about the form of unique and special laws that we have to construct to enforce and implement those inherent rights in every sector. Enforce and implement the inherent title to lands and resources. And once we get all that done, that'll be how we move ahead with implementing our inherent sovereignty, our inherent rights by sector, and our inherent title to lands and resources. Now that is what all of our nations have in terms of inherent rights and title. Now when we look at the national powers of governing, I don't know if you know, but historically, our kinship clan system was the most effective democratic system of government in the world. Most people that have come to Canada come from countries that only have dictatorships. They know nothing about democratic systems of governing. And they borrowed from our systems by studying the functions of our clans. And those functions of the clans are pretty identical to what they call the legislative branch, judicial branch, and executive branch of government that they identify as a democratic system of governing today. But we had something else in our governing structures. First of all, the women, the grandmas, the mums, all the women in the family and the community, they made the laws for the home, for the family, and the community. That's the powers that the women had in our traditional systems of governing. The churches and the governments outlawed that, made it illegal for the women to exercise their powers of governing. And when you look at the whole system of governing, we had portfolios. In what form? We had portfolios that had highly structured and disciplined societies in every sector involving our people in governing. And those highly structured and disciplined societies is what made our governments function and deliver programs and services and all the responsibilities we had in governing. The Medicine Society, for example, some of these societies crossed the boundaries of all our nations. Well, the Medicine Society existed in every nation, and they came to neutral grounds to exchange their knowledge and their information on medicines and healing and treatment of diseases. And one of the sites is at Waters, Saskatchewan. You can go there and still see the teepee rings where the medicine people came to a neutral ground to exchange all their information. And we had several societies like that that made our government work effectively. Now, when we look at the process, of course, of governing, we have the powers of governing that includes all the internal affairs under our government jurisdiction and law, all the external affairs and international affairs under our government jurisdiction and laws. But that has to be implemented under our inherent sovereignty of our nations and the powers of governing. And that's what was outlawed by the government, and you'll see when I go into their colonial policies how they've done that. But all that exists today. It existed historically, it existed during treaty making and post-treaty. So all of what I just outlined to you and identified with you is what exists today. But what are we doing collectively and individually to implement the stuff I've just identified for you? Because it's what impacts on us. Now when I look at the process of the national powers of treaty making, we didn't put everything on the table when we made treaty. And all the inherent sovereignty, inherent rights by sector, inherent title to lands and resources, they're reserved, recognized, confirmed, and guaranteed by the national powers of treaty making and the treaties. without identifying all what I just provided to you for information. So when you make the treaties, then the national powers of treaty making, it was done like what I described. Our sovereignty was never on the table for negotiation. It's reserved, recognized, confirmed, and guaranteed by treaties and treaty making. Now, when we look at the treaties, you can go to that treaty map. Now, you see all the white in the central part of Canada? That's Treaty 1 to 11. And Treaty 11 goes up into the territories where it's overlapped by a couple of modern treaties today. But the number treaties 1 to 11 form one major treaty between the Crown and Indian nations. And when we look at those numbered treaties, we took treaty number 6 to the UN to examine the status of it. And they declared Treaty 6 as an international treaty. But to maintain the status of an international treaty, both parties have to give them legal effect under their government jurisdiction laws. Now, we haven't done that, neither has Canada. So there's no laws giving legal effect to the treaties and treaty rights. Never mind the laws that are needed to give legal effect to inherent rights. So when we look at that map, you see the colored portions of Canada. Those are the modern day treaties. And those are called domestic treaties. Why? Because only one party to the treaty, to those treaties, has given them legal effect under their government jurisdiction and laws. Like when we talk about the James Bay Cree-Naskapi Agreement, there's the James Bay Cree-Naskapi Act that's passed by the federal government and the Quebec government. But no James Bay Cree-Naskapi Act passed by the James Bay Cree governments. So that's some of the homework we have to do in terms of looking at how we implement and enforce the treaties and the treaty rights. But now we have inherent rights and treaty rights. So when we talk about the implementation of treaties, we cannot do that without identifying how we have to implement both inherent rights and treaty rights, for example, to education, inherent rights and treaty rights to health, to social development, to justice, to economics in terms of the economy, and so on. And we talk about the lands and resources. When we made the treaty impacting on lands, we reserved the sovereignty of the Cree Nation and other nations, remaining intact in the title to the lands and resources by treaty making and the number of treaties we have, including Treaty 6. Now, the government changed the status of those lands under the Indian Act, and today they're now known as fee simple land status under federal jurisdiction ownership, formally setting up federal municipalities on reserves by ban, without the consent of the families and the members of the bands. And they trying to terminate the sovereignty remaining intact in the title to the lands and resources that we reserved by treaty making. Now, I'm not talking lands just for reserves by a ban. I'm talking about the lands and the territory for lands and resources throughout treaty territory, throughout our traditional ancestral lands territory. We reserve the title to those lands and resources. How could you exercise the right to hunt, fish, and trap and gather without having the direct access to ownership of lands and resources? So now you see how it's important that when you talk about treaty implementation and enforcement, that you need to know what the inherent rights are, what the inherent sovereignty is, and what the inherent title to lands and resources are that's granted to the nations and the peoples by the Creator. Then you can give meaning to what the elders call implementing the spirit and intent of treaty. So when we look at the treaty then, the treaty provisions, in a document that I handed to you, we reviewed the treaties, provisions of treaties from 1 to 11, and how they recognize, for example, the treaty right to education. Treaty right to education provides for a school that has to be maintained with teachers and operations and maintenance of the schools. Now, when we look at that, the treaty right to education, we're talking about the treaty right to education from kindergarten, nursery to grade 12, but it also includes post-secondary ed, or trade, skills, and professional education. That's what the treaties provide for the treaty right to education. So how do we implement that traditional contemporary system that provides for implementing inherent rights and treaty rights in that education sector? We need to design the policies and the laws that will give legal effect to a traditional contemporary education system that includes the implementation of inherent rights and treaty rights. And we need to develop a budget for implementing those programs and services. Now, when we look at the process for implementation of programs and services, how is it done? The governments are supposed to have laws and policies that govern program standards in every sector. So we would implement a traditional contemporary education act under our government jurisdiction and laws, implement inherent rights and treaty rights to education, but those laws would govern all the program standards in education. That would include certifying our own curriculum, our own schools, and looking at how we put together the program standards for all the programs and services we need in the traditional contemporary education system. Now, I'm giving you a model of the type of thing that needs to be done in every sector. All the areas that I touched on for implementing the traditional contemporary education system has to be implemented in every sector, the traditional contemporary economy. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But when we look at this process then of treaty making, these are the national powers of treaty making that I'm talking about. And when people go to talk about treaties, they immediately go to treaty rights in their discussions, missing over half of what the people need to deal with and understand about treaties. Now, you have the background and information that I just gave you, everything that leads up to the national powers of treaty making. And I just highlighted for you how we negotiated that whole process of treaty making, exercising those powers to enter into the treaties that result in a whole range of treaty rights. So now we have both inherent rights and treaty rights. Now, for the Métis, I worked with Métis for years, and they understood, the ones I worked with, you had to maintain the recognition of your inherent rights and status, respecting these inherent rights of Indian nations. But without that, you don't have those rights. And it's up to the Métis Nation now to exercise that responsibility in terms of the recognition of the inherent rights of Indian nations and people. And that's where your heritage comes from, as Métis people. Now, moving on to looking at the impact of the relationship of the settlers and us as Indian people for 500 years, let's take a look at those policies and let's examine those. And we'll start with the Doctrine of Discovery that was implemented by the empires of England, Spain, France, and Portugal. They divvied up the world so that the Empire of England had North America, Australia, New Zealand, and parts of India. Portugal and France had Africa. Spain had South Central America. Now, the Doctrine of Discovery was organized to send explorers out to take control and ownership of our lands and resources, where our nation already existed, owning those lands and resources. So they ended up in the Doctrine of Discovery process identifying that they stole those lands from nations. So they wanted to validate that theft of land and resources. So what did they do? They went to the Pope of the Catholic Church, who issued a papal bull, 1493, in the 14th century. And the papal bull identifies that indigenous peoples are not human or Christian. Because they're not human, they don't have sovereignty nor government. Because they're not human, they do not have title to lands and resources. Because they're not human, they don't have rights. Now I'm talking of 1493. We're sitting here today in 2020. Are we still not dealing with the same issues? Yes, we are. But there's another document that the Pope issued that is not talked about. And most of the people I've talked to and done this presentation to, I said, how many know about the document that the papal bull that the Pope issued called the Law of Dominance? What's the Law of Dominance? Well, the Law of Dominance makes it legal to kill indigenous peoples. That's why you saw the slaughter of many of our indigenous peoples by the explorers of those nations worldwide. And that was in the millions, of slaughtering of our people. Now you see, many of the historians, including one historian who was Indian, that said, oh, all of this doesn't exist anymore. It was terminated in the 17th century. And I told him, I said, like hell it is. You know anything about the 1830 detribalization policies of the empires of England, Spain, France, and Portugal? He says, no. I said, well, those are the policies that were designed to carry on with the papal bull, Christian instructions, and the doctrine of discovery. Now you see, those papal bull Christian instructions were implemented how? They were implemented in Christian laws and policies of the churches and the governments of the empires. And those still exist today. So when you look at the 1830 detribalization policies, and those were targeting the termination of individuals, families, extended families, communities, and societies of our nations. The residential school is not the only one policy they implemented. They made laws to outlaw our sovereignty, outlaw our governments, outlaw our jurisdiction, outlaw our language, our culture. And I could go on and on for you. They outlawed our ceremonies, our lodges, and so on. When they look at that 1830 detribalization policies with their objectives that I just identified, Canada then implemented what you call the 1947 plan to liquidate Canada's Indian problems in 25 years. And there again, most people don't know nothing about that policy. What is it? It's a policy to terminate all those treaties I showed you. A policy to terminate the special rights and status of Indians. A policy to transfer the federal responsibility for Indians in health, education, social development, child welfare, justice, and so on, from federal jurisdiction to provincial jurisdiction. That's in 1947 that started. Here we're sitting in 2020, and that's what's being implemented today. And I'll show you how. Now there's much more to that policy of liquidation of Canada's Indian problems that included setting up federal municipalities on reserves by ban, and that's what's being done today. Now, the 1974-76 Native policies, formally implementing those local governments under federal jurisdiction or provincial jurisdiction, not under any First Nations government jurisdiction laws, but it was designed to hire Indians, Métis, and Inuit in the front lines of government to continue to implement these colonial policies. And the latest one, most people don't know about, is the 1980 Buffalo Jump, a genocide policy issued by Mulroney and his government. The '69 White Paper is genocide policy implemented by Trudeau and his government. When we look at the '69 White Paper policy, then we also have to include that in that list that we see there on that chart. It's been done in other charts, but the '69 White Paper policy has to be included there right after the 1947 liquidation plan. So when we talk about all those historical colonial policies, I've just given you 500 years of our relationships impacting on settlers and indigenous peoples, not just here in Canada, but other parts of the world, as you know now. So in 1969, they set up a process to target how they were going to terminate the special rights and status of Indians. How? By amending existing laws or constructing new laws. So Bill C-31, a lot of Indian people were happy they were going to get their status back. Well, now under Bill C-31, they're not only terminating Indians individually, they're terminating whole families at a time now. And they have two sections under the Indian Act for the registration of Indians. One section of the Indian Act provides for the recognition of Indians and registers them as Indians having full benefits and rights. The other one, the Indians have no benefits or rights. They just have Indian status under the Indian Act. So when we look at these whole strategies that I'm talking about, what impacts on the relationships today? Okay, when we go back, I'll go back to those colonial policies and the impact of them first. When we go to that policy and looking at the degree of control we lost, you see, we lost total control of our political developments and our governments. We lost total control of our social developments, of how we used to have, and we still have, a social safety net that provides for the teachings of life, stages from birth to death, and the various stages of life that are taught, and the teachings of the roles and responsibilities of male and female. That whole social safety net, including traditional parenting, still exists today, but most people are not using any of it. But we lost control of that as well. We lost spiritual control, lost control of education, health, economic, social development, lost control of our culture and language, our lands and resources. And you see, when a society loses total control like that, what happens? You can list all the symptoms that result from losing total control. There's low self-esteem, poverty, addictions, there's suicides, there's abuses, mental abuse, physical abuse, the harm that's done in terms of the violence, the lateral violence. You could go on and on with all the symptoms that have resulted from losing total control. Now, what are we doing today? We're trying to fix those symptoms instead of dealing with the real causes of how we take control of implementing them under our jurisdiction and laws and exercising our way of dealing with all of those. That chart on the right-hand side is the chart that identifies that relationship. But the one on the left-hand side now, that's what we're doing to implement all those colonial policies I just highlighted for you. So as you see, under provincial law and jurisdiction, we're incorporating all these corporate entities on reserves and by tribal councils and the FSIN and AFN. All these institutions that we have are structured and implemented under provincial or federal corporate law, implementing those colonial policies. And the ones that are not being done there, they're being done under the federal policies of laws that they make for elections. They have a First Nations Election Act, a Fiscal Accountability Act, a Land Management Act, and all that stuff, implementing laws under Section 9124 of the BNA Act, not implementing laws under Section 35 that recognizes everything that I talked about at the start. along with the recognition of our treaties. So that's what we're doing today to terminate ourselves. And if you see the top of that chart, it says self-termination. We're engaged in that, in every level. Now, what governs our self-determination, our sovereignty treaty relations, is the chart you see on the right. There's the inherent sovereignty of our nations and the Crown's assumed sovereignty. And under our inherent sovereignty of our nations, you see the listing of the type of work we have to do to enforce and implement our own sovereignty. And then on the federal side, the Crown assumed sovereignty. When we look at that framework, how is it governed? It's governed by the inherent sovereignty and the Crown's assumed sovereignty. It's governed by our inherent rights that I described earlier. It's governed by the treaties, but it's also governed by the Royal Proclamation of 1763. So the late Judge Dixon told me, he said, "Chief, never let them leave that out of the Constitution." And here's why, as far as I'm concerned, he said. That's a form of royal instructions or a Bill of Rights that provides for us having to recognize your sovereignty, your national powers of governing, national powers of treaty making, and treaty making between the Crown and Indian nations, and most important, to recognize all of your inherent rights and title. So that is now in the Constitution Act, Section 25(2), still applying the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And of course now we have the international laws and the UN Declaration. Now the UN Declaration is one international instrument that identifies everything that we have and that we have to implement. But there's also now the Organization of American States Declaration that's similar to the UN Declaration, but goes in more depth in the recognition of our treaties. So that's what governs that framework that you're looking at. But down the middle of it, something that nobody talks about and deals with. You hear them talking about treaty relations, treaty relations, treaty relations. But nobody talks about all those relationships that have to be implemented, that is recognized by that framework that governs the Crown Indian nations relations. So we have the political relations. In what form? Recognizing the equality of our government, jurisdiction, and laws of our nations, of the federal government and provincial government. Now that's not new. You go across the border, you have federal, state, tribal jurisdictional laws and courts and governments being implemented. Now that requires an interface of government, jurisdiction, law, and I'll come to that. So then the other one then, besides political relations, is the treaty relations that's recognized by that framework. So I covered that for you and how we need to look at implementation of those treaties under our respective government's jurisdiction and laws, and how we implement inherent rights and treaty rights in every sector with unique and special laws of our governments and our nations, and the federal government that can now legislate under Section 35 their legal fiscal responsibilities. Judicial relations. We keep complaining about the policies and the systems that are there. Besides creating those policies that I highlighted for you, the loss of control and the impact of loss of control, the other thing that's done by those policies, those colonial policies, they create systemic racism. Systemic racism in all programs and services by departments and in governments, and systemic racism in the justice system and the legal system of Canada. Now, when we talk about our own justice system, then I'm talking about implementing our own traditional contemporary justice system with our own courts, our own institutions, our own policing and everything under our government jurisdiction and laws. When we look at the economic relations, then we can examine more fully what a First Nations economy would look like, but I designed one that can be applied for implementing inherent rights and treaty rights in every sector of the economy, and looking at how we have ownership and equity in every sector of the economy. The government wants to talk about resource sharing. Well, they implement for development of resources a royalty fee, a federal provincial royalty fee on all resource development. I'm saying we can implement a First Nations fee on all resource development, and we can divvy up the resources and the revenue. There's much to be done on the whole field of economic relations, implementing our economy that's community-based, regional, national, international. When we look at the process of fiscal relations under that framework, there's no reason why we can't have our own Finance Administration Act covering the field of how we provide for budgeting and the financing of our governments, how we do accounting, auditing, all the things that impact on fiscal relations, including setting up our own departments of finance. And when we look at that process, then that act would govern how we develop and implement a government-to-government fiscal relations with the federal government, where they have their jurisdiction under their Finance Administration Act. We're still tinkering around with contributions and that type of stuff, with bands getting funding only for unreserved population, when the NISCAs get funding for their total population based on their NISCA Citizenship Act for accounting for their total membership. Now that type of stuff needs to change, and that's the type of thing that I'm working on with others to get them changed. So there's much to be done on the fiscal relations area, but we need to move ahead with implementing and developing our own model for the financing and budgeting of our governments of our nations. Then of course comes the international relations. And I gave you some idea of what needs to be done by us to enforce and implement the UN Declaration, but there's much, much more that we can do in terms of international relations under our government jurisdiction and law. Like that economy I'm talking about, we can occupy the field under our own Trade and Commerce Act and how we regulate our affairs in terms of the economy internationally. Now when we talk about all of this, you see, we have portability of our sovereignty, of our inherent rights, our treaties and treaty rights, portability between the communities, portability regionally, nationally, internationally. And that issue of portability then is not only recognized by treaties, but it's also now recognized by Section 35 of the Constitution Act of Canada. Now I said earlier on the left-hand side, Canada has self-government policies that many are buying into. Section 35 now provides for the capacity for the federal government and parliament to recognize everything you see on that chart under First Nation sovereignty. And Section 35 now provides for the capacity for the feds to legislate their legal fiscal responsibility in every sector, recognizing inherent rights and treaty rights. So just recently they passed the Child Welfare Act on January 1st of this year for implementation. That's the first act they've passed federally to implement Section 35 in the UN Declaration. I took on Minister Bennett and Joe Wild, the ADM in Edmonton. I said, all those laws you're passing, the Election Act, the Finance Administration Act, the Land Management Act, I said, all those laws you've made, they're just a series of Indian acts. They're not new laws, but they're only implemented under Section 9124 of the BNA Act. You're trying to limit the application of Section 35. So Minister Bennett come and found me at the AFN Assembly last time, and she said, we done it. She said, we now passed legislation that gives legal effect to Section 35 in the UN Declaration. But the next one now is going to be the health. So they're looking at how they're going to construct federal law under giving legal effect to Section 35 and the UN Declaration. So to pick up on where we left off, that we look at the strategies for implementing our powers of governing and understanding that relationship besides the chart that's there on the screen, where we have inherent sovereignty, as I already told you, granted to our nations and peoples by the Creator, with inherent rights granted to our people and nations by the Creator in every sector. And of course we have the natural laws that govern the enforcement and implementation of those. And when we look at the national powers of treaty making, it's nations that make treaties. Treaties do not make nations. So to some degree that modern day treaties are ratifying and implementing their form of government. When our treaties are international treaties that recognizes our sovereignty, our government, and so on, you see. So the treaties, of course, when we talk about the inherent sovereignty, existed before we made treaty, during treaty, and after treaty. In other words, post-treaty. Now, when we look at band status under the Indian Act, that's powers under the federal government that's been implemented since the late or middle 1800s. Now, what happened under that process is they made it illegal for us to assemble as Indians right up to 1956 under the Indian Act. And they outlawed our government, our jurisdictional laws. So in the 1900s, after we made treaties, they had the Indian Act for chief and councils to be elected. And right up to the mid-1950s, then we had Indian agents in charge of everything, even though we had chiefs and councils. But they had no power, no authority. Then in 1960, the government changed that to implement a self-administration policy, setting up administrative structures under chiefs and councils, implementing programs and services through federal or provincial jurisdictional laws, not under our laws. 1960 I'm talking about, here is 2020, and we're still doing the same thing. This is an area we don't talk about either. What is the interface of law and jurisdiction? How do we deal with the interface of that legal jurisdictional relationship? Well, in the US, we have interface of jurisdictional law and courts, tribal government, state government, and federal government. In Canada, we have the interface of jurisdictional law, the French Civil Code in Quebec, implemented by the Quebec government, and we have the English common law implemented for the rest of Canada. So what I'm saying now, under that framework I showed you, we can implement our own First Nations jurisdictional laws. So they have to get the hell out of the way or move over. Because we need to move ahead now with how we move ahead in implementing the interface of jurisdictional law respecting First Nations governments, or Indian Nations governments, federal government, and provincial government. Okay, this is that framework I highlighted for you that governs our relationships in terms of the sovereignty treaty relations, nation to nation, government to government relations. That deals with the interface of jurisdictional law by band, tribal council, and FSIN. In terms of the interface of our own laws and jurisdiction. Like I gave you an example earlier about citizenship and membership and how we can legislate our own Cree Citizenship Act that includes the recognition of dual citizenship status. So if an individual from Dene Nation falls under our jurisdiction laws, under dual citizenship status, they retain their special rights and status as Dene, but gain the special rights and status of Cree. That type of thing, you see, is the type of unique and special laws I keep talking about that we have to be prepared to look at for implementation. But you see, we don't go there again. We don't go to the discussion of interface of jurisdictional law between the bands themselves between the bands and the tribal councils, between the bands, tribal councils, and the Federation of Nations. We're good at coming to forums and assemblies and talking about programs and services, but we never talk about the jurisdiction, government, and laws that have to be implemented collectively, not just one band or just one chief and council. As a nation, we need to be putting in place these governing structures, jurisdiction, and laws collectively. But again, we're not doing that. Okay, next one. Next one. Now you see a framework that I just highlighted for you that governs Crown Indian Nations relations. And I walked you through that. But that framework governs Parliament and the federal government. Like the other day, the Justice Minister and Prime Minister set up a rights directorate, a division in justice, and they hired a guy named Jesse McCormick as the director of rights. Well, the first thing he said to me was, when we talked, he said, I got a big problem. The Prime Minister wanted to implement a rights framework, but it was rejected by AFN and everybody, he said. I said, Jesse, nobody can reject the framework, the rights framework. So I highlighted that framework that you see there in number 1 that I just highlighted for you on the Sovereignty Treaty Relations Framework. That's the rights framework. That's what governs the rights in terms of our the rights framework that they're looking for. So that's all there, but they got to terminate those colonial policies, you see, that they have. That's still in their laws, their institutions. So then number 3 there, sovereignty of Indian nations. I showed you how it exists, where it comes from, and we need to set up our own justice system and our own legal system if we're going to have sovereignty in government. So we have an FSIN convention that people don't even know about. The convention is an agreement, a political agreement signed between the bands of Saskatchewan. We traveled 2.5 years to get it ratified by every band through the membership, not just through chief and council. So the Federation of Nations is lawfully and politically organized through that convention. And we have a Convention Act that governs, under our own laws and jurisdiction, all the governing bodies, like the Assembly. So we have, those seats are designated to each band, not to a chief. There's no reason why all those seats can't be full all the time when we have our lawful assemblies, where we make our laws and our policies and provide direction for everything we need to do collectively. So then we have the Indian Government Commission, that act that's under that Convention Act, the Executive Act, and so on, see. So now we have the First Nations University of Canada Act, establishing their own university. Now it's not being implemented, those things are not being implemented because our own people don't believe in our own jurisdiction and our own inherent legal systems. But it's all there, you see. It's the foundation that's been laid to do everything that we're talking about having to be done. Now we've graduated over 4,000 students from FNUC, not knowing nothing about FSIN. All the stuff I talked about and showed you, that I call the Code of Silence. Now how many are teaching what FSIN is right in our schools today? Grade 12 students graduating with no knowledge about FSIN. University students graduating with no knowledge about FSIN. Now whose fault is that? It's not Trudeau's fault. Nobody's fault. But ours. See? See how colonial we've become? That has to change. Next one. Now most places I go, when they see this one, I say, first of all, those are not bingo dabbers. It gets everybody's attention when I say that. See what those are, is I showed you those relationships that go down the middle of that sovereignty treaty chart. The political relations, the treaty relations, the judicial relations, the economic relations, fiscal relations, and international relations. We need secretariats for every one of those relationships, you see? And I told Minister Bennett, I said, you're not going to do a damn thing unless you have these secretariats and these political secretariats, policy secretariats in your office. But I said, you need them, we need them, you see? So then you can focus on how you're moving ahead with implementing all those relationships. Right now, nobody's doing it. Not even talking about it. So how do you implement that comprehensive legal political relationship without that type of capacity? You see? And that's at every level. The band, tribal council, FSIN, the Métis Nation needs, the Inuit Nation needs. See? No question, the province is needed. But that's what that's about. Next one. Now here's the process for looking at how we have to put in place unique and special laws. And at the bottom is just a listing of all the different sectors that need unique and special laws under the federal government and First Nations governments. And then dealing with the fiscal relations and financing in every sector, you see, based on our own Finance Administration Act, the Federal Finance Administration Act, implementing fiscal relations and financing in every sector. Next one. Now you see, when I met with the Minister of Finance, his Chief of Staff was there. So he wanted to talk to me after. And he said, what is this chart? He wanted to go through all the charts in that document. So we did. He said, what is this chart? I said, well, we have chiefs and councils as governments of our nations. They need human resources and financial resources. And this is just some of what we're demanding them having to do. But they don't have the money, they don't have the human resources. I said, that's what that chart is about. How do we get the financing to them? Every chief and council, every tribal council, FSIN. And he said, how many? How much? He said, a minimum of 300,000 per band, just for the policy secretariats. How many bands? 74. 21 million, he said. No, I said, we need tribal councils, treaty area, and FSIN funding as well. I said, before you tell me you don't have the money, let's examine where you've spent money and created new funding arrangements since 1982. You're now in the billions of dollars in the form of Aboriginal funding that's going out to establishing a whole bunch of Aboriginal positions in governments, federally, provincially, and programs and services that have no foundation. And you can redirect a major chunk of those multi-millions of dollars to what I'm talking about. And he agreed. But the resistance came internally. I don't want to go there. Now here's a place that we never go to. Nobody that I know of has taken the time to examine the sources of revenue. Not even in government. Now that's just a chart identifying the various sources of revenue that exist right now, today. So what is the total funding that we're entitled to under the treaties and the Constitution in that light green section up there, you see? How much is that? Do we do that or we don't do that? The next one is revenue sharing. They announced all these matching revenues for economic stimulus and infrastructure, eh? To go to provinces, territorial Nunavut, and municipal governments annually. Now that's new money over and above what it's costing them to run their governments, federally, provincially, territorial Nunavut governments, and just under 4,000 urban and rural municipalities. That's all new money for them in terms of those matching dollars. But we don't give a damn cent. And I'm saying, look, we want our share. We can identify our own source revenue being matched by the feds. And they agreed to that. And the next one there, of course, is the social transfer of funding, supplementary funding to the provinces. Go to the next chart. Now this is what you call a social transfer of funding that goes from the feds to the provinces. And I designed it as a First Nation social safety net, so those funds are transferred directly to our governments and institutions. Now, the first part of that social transfer that goes to the provinces, they just announced 81.6 billion this year to go to the provinces this year for that funding. And that funding in the health sector covers funding for hospitals, Medicare, optometrists, dentist care, levels 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 care. And why they created level 5 care in health is to meet the costs that are created by the, what do you call that, FASD?
Funeral cost surgeon?
That type of stuff, yeah.
Yeah.
That's why they created that division for healthcare. There's major funding in there.
Oh, is it?
You see? So then it includes the special needs funding. Now, because I designed this as a First Nation social safety net, I added our traditional health systems. And on the other side of the chart, you see the social development. That includes child and family services funding. It goes from the feds to the province. But they don't fund child and family services for Indians from the province. It's all federal funding that goes to them. Now, those home care and elders care, levels 1, 2, 3 care, not treatment, it doesn't go to level 5 care. It's level 1, 2, 3, 4 care in social development and special needs. Now that's all supplementary money to maintain the cost standard of living for non-Indians, you see. Now when they get that funding transferred, we're included in the population count of the money that flow to the province. And we see none of it. And the other part is education. The feds fund university and post-secondary ed. They transfer social development funding in the form of education to finance universities and colleges, supposedly to cut down the tuition costs.
Yeah, right.
But Treasury Board set up research divisions, several corporations for research development by universities. So we have the First Nations University that they're refusing to recognize as a university. So we can't access our share of funding to the level we can, eh? And I'm working on that now to get the process acknowledges the recognition of our university under our Convention Act, and the First Nations University of Canada Act. Now the interesting one on this whole thing, you see, is that bottom part there. It's called income security. That's where the child tax credit comes from. And these are funds now transferred from the feds directly to individuals or families. It doesn't go through the province or anything like that. It goes right to individuals. So there's the elders' benefits, like the pension plans. And they have a Canada pension plan, but they have a Quebec Canada pension plan. So when Trudeau first got elected, I don't know if you know, but he called for a special review of this social funding, eh? But he wanted a special review of the Canada pension plan. So what's wrong with having a First Nations Canada pension plan? Nothing. And they have that economic assistance, or what they're dealing with now. When I was chief at home in the 70s, my allocation for funding was 3/4 of it was social assistance funding. And I had 2 jobs, one band administrator and one welfare administrator. And people needed jobs for the homes. I had one family, 31 of them living in a 2-bedroom house.
Oh my God.
90-year-old elder lying on the floor. And they had one job. So I took that social assistance money and I created what I call an economic subsidy. And it's for what? Standard of living. You need utility funding. You need rent money or mortgage funding. You need money for food, transportation, child welfare if you need, child care if you need it, but other supplies, eh? So I identified that cost as a economic subsidy. They'll go to individuals, the total amount, or to families. And that stayed intact if they continued, wanted to go to education. So I set up what you see today is that education and social programming. We started at James Smith and offered the degree programming right in our school. The mother and daughter graduated with their degree in social services at the same time. But you see, the mother kept that economic subsidy as long as she stayed in class and went to school. Same thing with a job. If you got a job, you didn't automatically lose your SA. That economic subsidy stayed intact until they made enough money to pay that cost of living. Now I laughed because Elsie and I were over in Ottawa meeting with Privy Council, and Katrina, she was then the Secretary of Cabinet, Deputy of Privy Council. He says, before we start the meeting, she says, I want to know what you did when you were chief. She said, I'm told you've done something with SA that worked. Now, before we start the meeting, I want to know what you did. I said, okay. I said, I implemented an economic subsidy. What's that? She said. So I told her what it was, like I just said. So what I did, I went and negotiated other funding. And Canada Manpower, it was called, it had these special programs for funding, for 5-year funding. They called them flip and flop, and and I accessed 5-year funding for different sources. So in 6 weeks, I created 165 jobs, along with the training for the teacher and social work, and kept those economic subsidies in place.
Yeah.
And everybody was happy, and the housing. 31 people, I gave them 3 houses. Everybody was upset with me, but they needed it. But you see, that economic subsidy, that's what I'm talking about there. So right now they're dealing with that issue of the unemployment funding federally.
Yeah.
So some Indians applied for it and they got rejected, not because of the policies or criteria, but because they're Indian. Now, the other one that they're using for, this is Revenue Canada now, and this agency that has this money for Service Canada under employment. Others are being rejected because they had employment and they earned an income on reserves. But under Revenue Canada's policy, that's not recognized as a salary. If you earn income on reserve, it's not recognized as a salary. So you can't be unemployed. Those are the policies I'm dealing with right now, you see. So when we talk about that economic subsidy, I'm saying what's wrong with transferring it all to the governments of our nations right now and creating this economic subsidy for individuals and families right now. Never mind the issue of the pandemic and emergency measures. It'll carry on after this crisis is over. But we got to do something different. I said, so, but Katrina, after I told her what I did, she says, "Oh, we got to do something like that." She says, "Like an income security, guaranteed annual income." She said, "That's what it is." I said, "But I call it an economic subsidy." But then you look at the whole area of shelter allowances, under that whole process, and then when I traveled the province of Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta on the issue of disabilities, I headed up the Medicine Chest Health Task Force for 2.5 years. I went to Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and met with disability groups, and they had pages of things that they needed, and I wanted that info to put into the task force findings. But I said, we got to fix this. I said, the way we're going to fix it, I said, we're going to push for a guaranteed annual income for the disabled in the income security section of transfer of funding to individuals.
Yeah.
And that's why you see it there. And to get a guaranteed annual income or something for the disabled. And of course, the people that were sitting there in wheelchairs were just waving. But he said he would. Remember, he came up with the Disabilities Act?
Yeah.
And it got rejected in a lot of places. So nothing really happened with it. Like, why? No? Why? And our people with disabilities are still struggling. Why the hell can't they get a guaranteed annual income? Next one, go back to that other chart. Now you see, that's just that one light brown part there, see, on that social safety net. Now you see the kind of money that's there, that we don't examine the source of funding that I keep talking about. Where is the revenue? Now you know, and you can see the kind of money that's there, just in that part. And then of course comes the treaty annuities under treaty. People should consider treaty annuities as being the $5 a year, the box of ammunition, that type of stuff. Well, when you talk about the treaty right to education, that's a treaty annuity. The treaty right to health, that's a treaty annuity. You see? Now just imagine the kind of money that's there. But never mind, why aren't we invoicing Canada for all those outstanding annuities right now? You see? We're not doing it. I guarantee you, if they had that agreement with us, they'd be collecting from us.
Yeah.
I did it once on ammunition. That was cheap. Treaty Day, they come with this little box of ammunition about the size of the thing there. They gave it to me, and I pushed it back to them. I said, no, I'm going to invoice you for what the treaties provide for. And under the treaties, it's $1,500 a year, for ammunition and twine. So they said, we're not paying it. Went back to the office and they wrote up the invoice, went back and handed it to them. No, we're not paying it. It's fine with me. I'll see you in small claims court. A check arrived in 1 week. Now you see what I'm talking about? Why aren't we invoicing?
Yeah.
All the bands I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Not just one small part of the invoicing. See, it also guarantees $1,000 a year for seed, grain, and fuel. Now, why aren't we invoicing that? There's so many areas that we're not even collecting on under the treaties. Now you go to the next one there.
Back or forward?
Right, no, right there's that brown part, the darker brown, the First Nations tax regime. Now, like I told you, on taxation, there's no jurisdiction for the feds or the province to tax us in any form at all. Under the treaties, that's guaranteed. No tax, no taxation. But we reserve the tax powers for ourselves. So we can develop a tax regime with tax laws that includes tax exemption if we want, you see, under our jurisdiction. But you look at the field of taxation, that's an awful lot of money. When you look at the taxation of resources, like I said, assessing a First Nations fee on all resource development, like they do with their provincial federal royalty fees, we can do the same thing. Why not? Now that's a source we don't go to and address formally. And the big one is that gray one, the First Nations economy. And I got a document here, for example. But this is a First Nations economy, you see, that we can implement. It's a community-based economy that's regional, community-based, regional, national, international. And when you look at the multi-national corporation that we could implement, like SIGA, it's owned by all the bands, one share a piece. What's wrong with a multinational pharmaceutical distribution center?
Is that
No.
And let's take the wholesale industry for our own artifacts that we can produce. Well, it's all the crafts that are there, right? But targeting the international market, it's huge.
I know.
But we had to put a wholesale distribution center to get the supplies at wholesale price, not retail price. See? Now those are just some examples of the kind of multinational corporations we could have. Like SIGA is owned by the 74 bands. And we distribute 80 million a year to the bands out of the SIGA revenue. It's not counting the fund that go to projects in PA and Saskatoon and stuff like that. And one of the big ones is the information communication system. Where is our high-tech system? Now this is a multi-purpose data center that is, you can connect by community, region, national, international. The Micmacs run a multi-purpose data center in Halifax, and they contract internationally, and they employ 600 of their members in that data center. This is a model of a data center. Now you see the connectivity that we need. Everybody likes this one. This is the connectivity at the band level for the health data and information, education data and information. Every sector needs that connectivity. See? That's right in the band, in the government system, by tribal council, band, FSIN. But it also connects to the provincial and federal systems. Now, that's what I'm working on for implementation. Now, you see, right now, we have this opportunity to implement this social safety net. So that all those monies you see there that we can't get access to right now, we would be able to access. Right now, we can't get access. So you hear them talk about the gaps in health and social development for Indians on and off reserves. Well, that's why. Because we can't access those monies.
Yeah.
You see? So under that First Nations social safety net, that type of funding would go directly to our governments and our institutions and our individuals. You see?